Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Protecting the Network Edge from APTs, 0 Days, and Ransomware. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'm the host for today's session. Before we begin, I did want to let everyone know that we are recording today's session, and we will make a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the slides available to you in a follow-up email in the next day or so. If you do have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and throw them into the Q&A. We will either take them as they come or save some time at the end to address your questions. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Chase. Chase, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everybody. Super excited to be here. My name is Chase Snyder. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Eclipsium, and I'm with my esteemed colleague, Wes Dobry, a multi-decade, multi-hyphenate expert in the area of network security, pumped to talk about protecting the network edge. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right into it. Wes is going to talk through some current day network threats. This is a topic that we as a company talk about a lot because we have a lot to discuss, and it's frankly a massively growing attack surface for many enterprises. And Wes knows a ton about it, so I'm excited to get into it. Wes, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself a bit. You can walk through the agenda, do your intro, and then take it away. Please
Yeah,
throw
absolutely.
questions in the chat, everybody. Thank you. Wes, all you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chase. So as Chase was mentioning, I want to go through a quick agenda of what we're doing today. I want to talk to you through how we got here, what some of the high profile exploits are, how the attackers are actually implanting into things like network appliances, and ultimately some takeaways out of this of things like how to protect the environment, some tools and techniques that you can use, and of course, lastly, how Eclipsium can help with that. So if you want to go to the next slide for me, Chase. Just as Chase was mentioning, I am a 25-year cybersecurity veteran, probably showing my age there. But my specialties are really in architecture and strategy for how to design security solutions and how to implement them effectively within organizations. Now, my expertise really has focused on modern threat vectors, which is things like hardware firmware attacks, identity deception, social engineering, and of course, our favorite AI of how we can do things like attack, defend, and poison AI models and LLMs and similar. Let's go ahead to the next one. We'll kick things off. So, long and short, it's 2025. How do we continue to keep hearing about things like network threats? Even we have a slide here or a thing here on the Verizon Business Data Breach Investigations report, where we saw in this latest report an 8x increase in network and edge device vulnerability exploitation. And only 54% of those vulnerabilities have been fully remediated even to date, or at least the time of the breach report being published. So long and short, this isn't actually new. What we're seeing is that this is just rapidly accelerating as we get to a point where things like operating system exploitation gets more difficult, we get stronger tools and things like EDRs. The attackers are finding new areas of opportunity, and that means they're moving lower in devices. They're moving to other areas that are opportunistic for their attack methods. We're also finding that your traditional attacks, things like phishing, aren't as successful against enterprises because of, the more advanced, tools for email protection, the more advanced web filters that we have out there, and of course, the stronger EDRs stopping a lot of those types of attacks. So that ultimately means that even the less sophisticated attackers are starting to use more higher level techniques. They're starting to build tools and use the things that were traditionally only available for nation state actors. And now we're finding that they're starting to leverage them in just the standard cyber criminal organization. The other thing that we're seeing from a trends perspective is that dwell time is getting longer, and dwell time being the amount of time an attacker exists in the environment is growing into months versus days. It used to be a scenario where a single device would get implanted, something would occur, you'd correct it, and the attacker was out of the environment. Now, since they've started moving to different arenas, they're starting to use combinations of techniques, things like credential stuffing, and then using lateral movement while attacking beachheads or external devices or things that have access to other devices more regularly. So these are meaning that they're finding multiple ways to infect or get into an environment, infiltrate the environment, and then adding in more ways for them to get back to it.
Yeah,
All right.
another interesting stat I'm going to throw out here about this. We don't have it printed on the screen, but this 54% of vulnerabilities were fully remediated in the environments that had these, and it still took a long time. It was like 30 plus days for those remediations to happen, which speaks to the dwell time stat. It's like this stack of network and edge vulnerability exploitation. Only half of them are even getting remediated, and the ones that are taking a long time. And all of that is kind of a recipe for a lot of potential harm to the enterprise that gets invaded in this way.
Perfect. Thanks, Chase. So, how did we actually end up getting here is when we look at things like our endpoint devices where we have, Windows, Linux, and Mac, we have all of these tools to patch these devices, to encrypt the disks, to harden the operating systems, to manage vulnerabilities, and of course, to detect threats and respond accordingly. What we've always ended up doing on the network side is simply put, we've treated them like black boxes. We've had to trust the vendors. And we've said things like, okay, if I'm buying this from you, I have a limit of liability if this device gets affected and things like that. We've had those contractual obligations that the vendor does the right thing for us. But ultimately, we've had to trust them that what they put on those devices is good, valid, and not vulnerable to attack. And what we're ending up finding is that because of this, we've had to build different tools and techniques for detection of infiltration into these devices and implants and, work accordingly to that. So, what this ends up looking like because we've trusted these vendors to do this is that, in 2005, we saw the first Cisco use rootkit. Then we didn't really see anything until 2008 with Cisco Raider. Then, as you see on these slides, that the attacks became a little bit more frequent. We started seeing more. We had in 2019 the SolarWinds attack, a real terrible, terrible thing. But we also saw more vulnerabilities as time goes on. We start seeing regular vulnerabilities in F5s and Fortinets and Citrix and ultimately we've gotten to a point where this is continuing to accelerate. It's the not only are the good actors, the researchers finding this stuff, but we're also finding that the bad actors are finding and exploiting things too. Even in this year, which we'll go into more of these attacks, but things like Silk Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, all of the different Typhoon APTs. But we're also seeing things like Juniper being exploited and having backdoors put into them. The 7 million, I feel like, Avanti 0 days that exist out there. And of course, we're also seeing things in Palo Alto firewalls too. So why is this actually happening? And I mentioned a little bit about this before that things are adjusting, but we're also seeing motives adjusting in the APT or the nation state sponsored groups. And what we're seeing is that they're moving from just being a cyber component to being leveraged more in well actual warfare, I guess you could say, or psyops. We're seeing them being leveraged more in things like espionage, IP theft, or even in politics. We're seeing a big growth in AI related threats, using AI for campaigns related to psyops, for example. But a lot of this is also around things like revenue generation. The ransomware groups are actually a multi-billion-dollar industry now. And when we take a look at it from that perspective, they're seeking money, fame, and power. And what we're finding is that traditionally they used to just go after endpoints. We're seeing them shift to going towards network infrastructure more. So you're hearing more about things like FortiGate reaching networks or a Cisco switch or firewall actually getting ransomware on it, or using something like a Palo to jump into something else and then do ransomware on it. And so these attack vectors are ways that they're finding avenues to infect a lot more stuff and do a lot more things efficiently. So, as with everything, Everything's about efficiency. And if they can improve that time to the time that they can get into an environment and automate it, then they're gaining access faster, easier, and more effectively.
Another super interesting stat from that Verizon DBIR that it's not really a stat, like there's not a hard number to it, but when you talk about revenue generation, Wes, the the a part of the discussion in that report is that even the nation state, APT groups function kind of like corporations. They have a lot of people working for them. Those people aren't necessarily getting paid as much as they want. And there's some speculation that some of them are doing sort of under the table revenue generation activities, even while they're doing the sort of nation state level espionage. So they're like getting into the big companies, they're living off the land, they're doing the espionage stuff, and then they'll just do like a little bit of ransomware, a little bit of crypto mining on the side to pad out the paycheck, which is like very very interesting combination of motives uh, among the individuals that make up these big complex groups that are conducting these advanced attack campaigns. So when you hear APT, I feel like historically there's been a little bit of a perception that you have to be an organization of a certain size and you have to have kind of a target on your back to be targeted by an APT. But really, everything is so interconnected, and the motives of both the organization and the individual are not 100% aligned to the point where anybody could be a target for any of these sort of attack approaches.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the shift in attack behavior is really interesting.
So are you saying that the nefarious organizations are also corrupt, Chase? Is that what I heard you say?
Turns out it's possible. I don't want to make any wild speculation, but I'll see if I can throw a quote from the DBIR report about it into the chat.
Oh, so when we look at this, when we look at why it's worse, is that network devices, to that black box kind of mindset, is that the firmware on them, and firmware in this definition takes anything that we as organizations can't directly control or inspect. And, so that covers things like the operating system on these devices. And that's largely proprietary. While a lot of this stuff is just traditional Linux under the covers, the network vendors don't actually give us the capability to inspect this stuff. So that generally makes it harder to exploit because a lot of this stuff is undocumented, and it makes it harder to persist because they use techniques to try to use non-writable partitions and make sure that the system boots in an ephemeral state. For example, like on Cisco iOS, it's a single image that's unpacked on boot using your embedded style operating system scenarios. But what we've seen is that a lot of network devices have started to grow and expand. So they're now using full operating systems, whether it be Linux or BSD. We're seeing some of them, like Junipers and Cisco's, that are using hypervisors or Kubernetes into them to run other things on top of them. So this has added in a ton of third-party dependencies, and which is starting to add things like supply chain risk. When we saw things like the XZ compromise, where we ended up into scenarios where if that did make its way into certain devices, you could have devices implanted or with that back door in it that we would never know about, for example. And then, we also have that tough challenge that there's not really an EDR for network devices in most cases. You end up in a situation where these devices are just running out there, and we have to trust that they are doing things the way that they're supposed to be doing and they haven't been infected. So this is my little call to action to any vendors that are out there, is that the vendors should take some ownership in this, is that we should start moving away from black box architectures. Companies and vendors themselves should become more transparent. We need to start moving towards not having ancient code built into these things and doing true cyber supply chain risk management, or CSCRM, and understanding what's built into something like an Avanti VPN. On the right, you see that tweet where it was, when looking at us up to date at the time VPN box, you had curl, which was 14 years old, OpenSSH or OpenSSL, excuse me, which was 6 years old, curl of 23 years. And this is ultimately a major problem. The vendors focus on building features and driving revenue, while, even security companies attempt to go and build an aura that they're, security minded. Security isn't the priority. Driving revenue is the priority. And if they do that with features, they're going to build features. So we end up in situations where the devices that we use are 10 or 20 years old from an architecture perspective, and where they just simply are not doing things the way that we can do them today from a security perspective. It also means that they try to use techniques like restricting access to things like shells, which make, digital forensics or incident response difficult or impossible on these devices. And it also means that it's not the easiest to patch a lot of these systems. And when we think of a lot of switches, for example, you're generally going through one by one and patching them in a lot of environments. And this is also the scenario where there's not really any financial motivation for vendors to improve because we're not holding them accountable as customers. And lastly, there's really no most secure vendor award. We're not giving an award to a certain vendor to say, hey, your stuff is actually secure and you're actually doing things right. We're, trusting that these vendors do it and buying based upon features. So, we see a big shift when we start to look for where and the high value targets that attackers are going after. And in 24-25, we actually saw a major pervasive attack against telecommunication companies, where we saw both in the US as well as internationally that they were being targeted by Chinese-based APTs. And, this includes companies like Singtel, AT&T, and others, where we've seen them actually start to target the older devices that haven't been patched to like branch routers in a lot of these cases. But we also saw a shift in March with Silk Typhoon to start targeting IT supply chains. So they're using a 0 day that was in Avanti Pulse Secure VPN appliances, in addition to some of these Cisco branch router attacks. And this goes back to underline the points before about attacking these beachhead systems so that they can then get into other environments. Now, ultimately, their goals in most of these situations were to get to things like the billing servers and such, start getting call metadata out or doing other nefarious things. But the long and short is that they targeted old, out of date devices with known vulnerabilities, and they were aware of all of these vulnerabilities already. But in the case of Silk Typhoon, also using things like 0 days. So we had to go and have the capability to identify even, malicious behaviors in addition to, unpatchable things.
Yeah, the sort of selection of attack targets and tactics, techniques, and procedures speaks to the different priorities that these organizations have, right? They want to they want to break in. They don't have to work too hard at it. They don't want to burn 0 days if they don't have to, probably. But also, another stat that I'll throw out from the DBR is that along with the increase in network device and edge device, especially VPN exploitation, has been a decrease in credential abuse. And so it's like pretty clear that these attackers are they want to pick the low-hanging fruit. They want to do the easiest thing for any step of the attack where there's an easy option. They're going to pick the easy option. And that used to be credentials. You buy them on the dark web for basically nothing, and you can use them. Now it seems like it's shifting towards targeting these outdated network and edge devices and VPNs. It's like, why would they be, fading down on the credential abuse and fading up on the network edge devices if network edge devices weren't some combination of easier and more valuable for the overall attack goals, which for for it to be easier or, at least more utilized to target these network edge devices than to use credentials that you can just buy for pennies on the dark web is really an indictment of the security of these network edge devices to me, or just the outdatedness. It's not like the current ones are massively insecure, although some of them are. But they stick around way past their shelf life and create this attack surface that is now getting just massively targeted.
Absolutely. So what I want to do now is I want to talk through some of the leading exploits that are actually happening out there today. We were just mentioning about Silk Typhoon, but a couple other of the 0 days that they actually were leveraging. So you see Palo here, you see Citrix, and you also see Avanti. So they're going after all three of those. The Citrix, you see that the CVE was actually all the way back from 2023 for when the CVE number was referenced, but they were leveraging these as part of their attack. We'd also seen them using Exchange, Entra ID, Zixel routers, and other components. Now, they heavily are leveraging things like implants within there, like you see on the right side, where we actually can detect their tiny shell implant that they're using. But ultimately, we're seeing them use a multitude of different avenues to get into environments. We also see in 2024 and 2025 Avanti Pulse Secure and Connect Secure, which was being targeted by China Nexus threat actors. And, in these things, this device is an SSL VPN appliance. And the vulnerability that was actually being used was a simple path traversal. So think of it, go out to a specific URL, do a path traversal, and you manage to get access to a shell when that shell also happened to be running as root. So this was unfortunately exploited as a 0 day. And then it also was an interesting scenario where when there were mitigations that were released by Avanti, that the mitigations were easily bypassed, and these bypasses were also delaying the patch release. So this escalated to a point where CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, ended up requiring the federal government to disconnect all Avanti Pulse Secure devices within 48 hours. So to combat this, Avanti ended up releasing an integrity checking tool, which was supposed to validate that the device was not implanted in any way, shape, or form, and was good from all the fixes. And that integrity checking tool ended up being able to be bypassed too. We actually did a little research internally here, and we're able to go and find that we could go and put things on a persistent storage partition, and the integrity checking tool never even saw it, never alerted about it or anything like that. So we were able to actually implant a device and keep persistency in that device even after checking with the integrity tool. So one of my favorites was actually from back in 2023, Citrix Bleed. This is also an SSL VPN appliance. Now, one of the reasons you see VPN appliances targeted is actually something that you saw come out of COVID for the most part. Is as we moved our workforces remote and home, the VPN appliances became more and more important in our architectures. We ended up in a scenario where we had, for the better part of 2 years, where you couldn't patch VPN appliances because you couldn't take them down and kill the sessions that were being used if you're a global organization. So you ended up in scenarios where these devices were also raising the priority levels from the attacker's perspective because they knew these devices were falling down level. Now, in this case, Citrix Bleed ended up being a buffer overflow, which, at this day and age, buffer overflows just simply shouldn't exist with the tools that exist out there to, monitor code and code best practices. But what this attack actually let the bad actors do was leak VPN session tokens. And so that's basically a key to initiate or get back into a VPN session. And this also was exploited as a 0 day by APT groups. Now, the fun part of this one was that while Citrix fairly quickly released a patch, the patch itself didn't actually reset existing sessions on these devices. So if a bad actor was already into the device, they could just simply reuse any of the session tokens that they had already collected off the system. So this attack really targeted a ton of different organizations, but I've listed some here like Boeing. It was targeting mortgage companies. There were some ISPs that were breached. But even after you ended up patching this thing, you couldn't tell if a session was being legitimately used or not legitimately used. And even though you were patched, you thought everything was good. But unless you manually went through the step to terminate all existing sessions and require all users to re-authenticate, reinitialize their sessions, you had no protection against this. So this is kind of a really big deal where it ended up with kind of a very botched patch release cycle. So Barracuda had an interesting one where this was with their email security gateway. And this is one of my favorite things because when you think of a security gateway like an email ESG here, you end up in a situation where I want it to inspect everything that's coming through it. So things like Office documents, I want it to look at everything that's in that Office document. And what ended up occurring here is that you could actually send a malicious Office document and do code execution on that device through that Office doc. So it would literally run the code that was being sent through from an external email. And in this case, it ended up actually allowing the threat actors to completely take over the device. And in this case, it was exploited by Chinese APTs as a 0-day. And this was actually first noticed because of some configurations that ended up with backdoors built into them. But this attack was so pervasive that after you were exploited with this attack, which all it took was an incoming email, that the device could be implanted so heavily that you actually had to replace the physical appliance or the virtual appliance in this case too, to actually go and fix any compromise of that device.
That's a really extreme outcome, but honestly, maybe for the best. If
Mhm.
part of the issue is that we have these outdated, vulnerable devices that getting forced to replace them, that was probably a pretty painful situation for those victims of that attack, though.
Oh, absolutely. And again, we see this across the board with things like F5s, where things as simple as header tampering. So you change literally a host header, and you could get into a device through, adjusting something on your end of the attack. And this one, of course, were allowed remote command execution. And then as soon as you exploited it, you could create PHP shells. You could do all sorts of other fun implantation on this thing. And again, since it's a load balancer, you have access to a ton of other stuff, like direct access into web servers and other things that you could laterally move from here. So this is a big deal because even though it was a beachhead device, it had access to a ton of other stuff within the environment. So let's talk a little bit about some of those implants now. And first thing that you'll see in many environments are the non-persistent implants. The implants that all you have to do is reboot the device and it kicks them out. And this is things like reverse shells with Netcat or NC as we all affectionately know it, or payloads that are done through a multitude of different tools. And you'll also see now a lot of these APTs as well as researchers are using the sliver command and control payload. This also applies to things like web shells that are stored in non-persistent storage. So something like an appliance that has a web service, you exploit the web service, you add something within that. That's where the web shell would be running on non-persistent storage or in memory, and you reboot the device and the bad actors are out of it. But what we're seeing in 2025 is that specifically on Juniper devices, you're actually seeing a new backdoor or shell being called Tiny Shell. So older Juniper routers, again, end of life Juniper routers, are actually being targeted with these backdoors. And Mandiant did some research and published that they say it showcases a development in this APT UNC 3886 in their TTPs. And it's focusing on ultimately for them to be focused on network and edge devices and implanting them with this tiny shell backdoor so that they can always get back into the device. Now, in these cases, this is typically going to be done in a persistent manner. So even if you reboot the device, even if you patch it, even if you reset it and start fresh, a lot of times these shells can actually still remain on the devices. And you end up in a scenario where now that device is always a way back in for those attackers. So you pop up with, your ESX environment gets ransomware, and you're going, how did this occur? And it could be because they came through a network appliance that could then go and traverse its way through other things in your network to get to those devices. And this is really where not having things like EDRs or some kind of anti-malware, anti-threat source on a network appliance comes into play, because these things can now dwell for weeks, months, and even years in some cases.
Yeah, this was a really interesting one this year because the tiny shell is like an open source based on C, I think, backdoor. It's like widely available thing, but these ones that were being used on Juniper were customized. I think there were 6 different customized versions, and I didn't want to cram too much more text onto this slide. I loved this quote, but there was another really great quote in the Mandiant write-up of their investigation of this where they said, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have it up in front of me, but they essentially said that it was their investigation was hampered. That is the word they used, because these network devices and these types of devices don't typically have instrumentation or the tools to provide the visibility that they needed. And so they had to come up with new novel ways of retrieving the artifacts that they needed for the investigation. And that felt really representative of the current environment to me, that even Mandiant is kind of a gold standard at this kind of thing, struggled a little bit with this investigation into an modified but an open source backdoor type system into these Juniper widely deployed routers. Think of the number of organizations that have these have Juniper routers in them, the percentage of those that are potentially end of life or beyond support. That then, if it gets backdoored, if it gets hacked into, the difficulty level of investigating that and resolving it is enormous, to the point where Mandiant called it out as a challenge. So there's a real blind spot there, and clearly the APT groups are taking advantage of that to an increasing degree.
You want to start talking about this one, Chase?
Yeah, yeah, sure. The Moon malware. Okay, so this is an old malware. This is like, I think it was dates back to like 2014, but there's been a resurgence of it to the point where the FBI issued this new warning in May of this year, it's like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, as of this speaking. Um, that end of life routers, particularly small office, home office, or SOHO routers, are being targeted, and with a resurgence of the Moon malware. And what this represents to me is the fact that you're never safe from what seems like an old or resolved, vulnerability or a malware. Like, there's constant sort of evolution or constant changes, and also old devices that are present in the environment. And also that small office and home office routers are a legitimate attack surface to be used either as, just part of a botnet or like honeypot network, but also some of these, SOHO routers, to what Wes was talking about earlier, are part of an overall enterprise environment now. Either, remote employees have it, or they've just, got it in some office or whatever. The idea that this type of device is not a target that can get you into an enterprise is flawed. And yeah, essentially, this malware has resurged and is being used against types of routers that you would think would no longer be out there in the world, but they clearly are. So the FBI is warning folks about this, despite the fact that this is like a decade plus old malware. And I think we're going to see more and more of that sort of resurgence of older malwares targeting these network edge devices and end of life routers, because, if it works, it works.
Yeah. And I mean, we're absolutely seeing a common theme here where these things are end of life. They're not getting patched. They have known vulnerabilities in it, and the threat actors are saying, well, if they're not going to do the due diligence to patch this stuff and or replace it, then we're just going to go ahead and attack it. And this is a major challenge because even though it may be a small office or a home office device, you can end up in a scenario where there's other things to compromise once you're into that device that are likely thought of as being better protected because they're not on the internet, for example. And there's a common fault where we think, oh, this device is internal to our network. Let's assume a threat actor isn't attacking it so we can have a little bit loosened security controls. And in those situations, now you have, the weak link here, which is some device that's end of life that we haven't replaced that has one vulnerability in it, gets exploited. And then they find a multitude of other ways and just leapfrog throughout an environment until they get to something juicy.
Yeah. It's anything that's on the edge, anything that's exposed to the internet, just assume that it's constantly under attack.
Yep. So, I mean, this is again echoed with the vicious trap honeypot, where, this is again Soho routers, SSL VPNs, even things like DVRs and baseboard management controllers or ILOs, iDRACs, and similar. Now, in this case, they targeted initially Cisco Soho routers. So this is kind of very similar to the Silk Typhoon and Salt Typhoon attacks too. But you'll see that they also targeted things like Avanti, Fortinet, Cisco ASAs, Citrix NetScalers, and more. And this is a huge one because they're largely just doing whatever they can to get into these environments.
Yeah, the list of devices that are being targeted and are potentially vulnerable, potentially getting incorporated into this big honeypot network, compromised edge devices are at the center of so much attack activity right now. It's represented in the DBIR stats and just in the CVEs that are coming out, the number of them that are in network edge devices. And a really wild thing to me about this is that a lot of the devices that are being targeted successfully are their purpose is to provide security, and they are in fact providing like the first step or the first like lily pad into the targeted environment. So when you get a firewall or a VPN that the company is hypothetically using to protect their data or to stop people from getting in, provide some insulation, and that actually ends up being the thing that the attacker compromises to get in, something is really broken about that.
Yeah, so what you'll see a lot is one of the first payloads an attacker group will drop into a device is simply a PHP web shell. And they often will use this as a backup payload. And we see on the right that it's an example of UNC 3542, where they would actually put in a web shell, a PHP web shell on an appliance and only use it when their quiet exit backdoor failed. So they would then use the PHP web shell that they knew existed on the device too, but then use that to fix their other backdoor, which gave them more capabilities. Now, we oftentimes see that anytime we get an unprotected upload path or anything like that, where these types of web shells will be used, the attackers will drop these into a GUI path where, as you're using the admin interface, they have a specific URL that they can go to and get back to their web shell. You'll also see that the more advanced threat actors will change PHP configurations. And they do this mostly so that if PHP restarts or if they want to do other things like give themselves additional abilities, they'll adjust PHP configs to do more things. Now, these are largely very highly detectable because it's relatively trivial to do a simple hash check against a set of directories before and after an update, for example, and maintain that list and make sure that there's nothing embedded in there that could be a web shell added into the environment. So in this case, this is where monitoring integrity against what is a known version on a system is going to come into play to detect things like these web shells that have been implanted in a device. We're also seeing some pervasiveness of the Sliver C2 framework. And this is really something that's being used by a few different APTs, but it's written in Go, so it's portable across pretty much every operating system, and it focuses on network appliances. Now, we saw this recently used in the Avanti campaigns. This is largely fairly easily detectable. It uses, some fairly large files in it, but it ultimately is something that's super capable by these APT groups to be leveraging. So it gives them a lot of opportunity to pivot to other devices. You can use it to proxy traffic through systems. We've used it in some of our tech examples here over at Eclipsium, where it's fairly trivial to go and implant this into something like an F5 device and then go and use it to jump into other web servers that you may already have it within. So Pacific Rim is another APT group that targeted persistence in firmware of devices that they were backdooring. And the main reason that they did this is to ultimately remain persistent through upgrade processes. And Pacific Rim was one of the first APTs where we saw more advanced techniques than we'd seen previously. They were using things like UEFI implants, where they were actually disabling Intel boot guard on appliances or attempting to bypass other security controls like Secure Boot. And when we see these types of attack, things like Secure Boot is ineffective because they can either just simply turn it off, or they can do things like adding in their own trust sources so that their malicious binaries can be trusted. Now, these threat actors actually targeted firewall appliances, which were ironically just basically PCs. Under the covers, they were Intel reference hardware. And Intel reference hardware, you end up in a situation where it's using the same standard threat, or I should say security techniques like Secure Boot and Intel processors and UEFI and similar. And the same challenges that you have protecting that layer of firmware are the same ones that you then have to worry about in something like a firewall. So we actually ended up doing a blog post on this where we actually broke down the specific firewall appliances and showed that they were basically just PCs and walked through all the different vulnerabilities and attack methods that an attacker could use for getting into the firmware of those appliances too.
Something interesting to point back to an earlier topic of conversation of vendors taking some accountability or doing things to make it easier for their customers or for investigators to uh, figure out what happened when it's appliances like this that are getting targeted is so the Pacific Rim uh, campaign targeted Sophos appliances, and I think they did some pretty major work to provide visibility into the appliances in order to enable over a period of like 5 years that they were kind of playing this cat and mouse game with this attack group. Um, they implemented a bunch of monitoring capabilities in their devices and appliances to make it possible to investigate these and provide that visibility to their customers, which is super unusual. Given what we were talking about before, that the normal behavior is for network appliances and vendors to provide a black box essentially. Like you can't really see what's inside of there. It doesn't, in fact, it's probably a violation of your contract with them to gain shell or to otherwise, try to get further visibility than they explicitly allow, which is not very much. And I think Sophos kind of bucked the trend in a way that I see as really positive in the case of this Pacific Rim situation, where they provided some more forensic analysis, improved their telemetry and detection and response capabilities, and provided that visibility to their customers in order to fight back against this attack campaign. So kudos to them, and more should follow this example, I feel. And a lot of this is written up in our blog post, which is a super deep dive into that whole attack campaign. Really interesting stuff.
Awesome. So with that, we want to talk a little bit about how Eclipsium actually focuses to kind of break that paradigm that Chase was just saying is now, vendors don't give us the tools to inspect this stuff. And Eclipsium is that tool that does that. So if you want to go to the next slide for me. And what Eclipsium does is we allow organizations to focus on trusting the technology that they use. And this is really broken into a few different avenues. Things like inventory in those devices, understanding what they're actually comprised of, what pieces, parts go into making that device operate, what hardware components, what firmware components exist within them, identification of risk within those components, misconfigurations, all different kinds of things around what can bring your organization risk. And then lastly is detection of those backdoors, implants, and response to them. So integrating with your existing systems to ensure that if a detection does occur, you are actually protected. Now we focus on a few different arenas, and Chase, if you want to go ahead and build the slide out with one more click, thank you, our focus is leveraging sensors to collect data from devices and feed that to our analysis system. So we separate collection of data from analysis of data. On the left side under one-time scans and continuous monitoring is our traditional approach for securing endpoints and servers, or really anywhere where we're running a traditional operating system like Linux, Mac, or Windows. The agentless remote scans is where we get things like network appliances, where we interrogate them remotely over things like SSH and APIs, or have those devices send us data that's pertinent to validating the integrity and security of those devices. Then lastly are other things, like if we have things like images of firmware that, a firmware update from a manufacturer and you want to see what it contains, those can be sent to us where we can validate the risk and integrity of it. Next slide. Now, all of this really is focused on we collect that data from the device through extraction of those bits of pertinent information. It goes to what we call automata. Automata is our analysis engine where we're looking at it from things like what does this thing actually contain? What software components make it up? What vulnerabilities, risks, threats, misconfigurations exist? And then on the right side, you'll see that we feed that data out through our API, out to things like SIM and source systems. We generate alerts. And of course, we also generate SBOMs or software bill of materials for devices as well. And the whole concept is again, building transparency into what exists in this environment because the vendors themselves don't really give us the capability to do it, or it's not easy to do at scale. We are the operational platform to monitor this stuff at scale. Now, when we get this data and we do the analysis, that's really where we're looking at it from a few different things. That's things like threat, risk, and misconfiguration. We're comparing it against our known good allow list or our cultivated data set of known good firmwares and baselines. We can also monitor systems for those baselines and change. So for example, if we're monitoring a system and we see something change on it, we can notify you accordingly of if we see a hardware, firmware configuration change. Last piece of the puzzle is also remediation of some of this risk through automated firmware updates. So that's updating firmware on things like your endpoints and servers to actually reduce the risk of threat and vulnerability. Now, looking at this from a slightly different perspective, again, on the left, we have the sensor. Sensor collects the data, extracts it from the device where we're going to give as much data as that device would give us. And that's things like metadata about the device, hardware information, raw firmware dumps from the device, as well as things like fingerprints from appliances themselves. That gets sent to automata on the right side where we're looking for things like indicators of compromise, heuristics, behaviors, vulnerabilities, risks, tracking for change, and lastly, of course, comparing against known good. Now, when we look at this, the big thing that you want to take away here is that we cover and we consider ourselves vendor agnostic. And as you see on this slide here, we cover a large number of the network appliance vendors out there. So that's things like Cisco, F5, Citrix, etc. And you'll also see some overlap here with some of the Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon campaigns. So the big thing here is that we're not only detecting the vulnerabilities that these attacker groups are using, we're also detecting the threats that they're implanting in devices, and we're also monitoring the integrity of those devices that their groups are attacking. So we can detect if you're vulnerable to their attacks, we can detect if they've attacked you, and we can detect if they've compromised that device and implanted it in a persistent manner.
Yeah, something this makes me think of is just the, as we're talking about the flow that Eclipsium uses, the attack surface that we're talking about and that's getting increasingly exploited in network edge devices, a lot of it is stuff that just is not effectively monitored or monitorable by current solutions. And so in some cases, that's like things in the boot process or before the operating system turns on and starts to be able to operate all the security technology. That's more on the endpoint side. And then in these appliances, it's like, yeah, it might just be like Linux under the covers, but they don't give you visibility into what is happening in there. And clearly, across all of these different vendors, it's not just these Typhoon sort of family of attackers that are doing this, but those have been heavily in the news because they're, targeting telecommunications, they're targeting critical infrastructure. There's sort of a global geopolitics and national security angle to it. But these types of attacks against these types of devices are only going to increase, as we have seen, are already massively increasing, um, as long as that attack surface continues to remain basically invisible and unmonitored and undefended. And watching, just looking at this list and seeing like knowing the global reach that these types of devices have, like Cisco iOS, Cisco NXOS, the breadth of enterprises that kind of stuff is deployed into, any business, any Fortune 500 that you can think of has those things in their environment. And I'm curious, Wes, what do you think that they're doing right now? Like how, in the absence of Eclipsium, in the absence of this visibility, what are they doing to protect those things? Like what's the sort of baseline security level of those right now? My guess is not a lot of finger crossing, uh,
I was
trusting
going
the
to say
vendor.
they hope and pray. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, a lot of this stuff, they're doing things like centralized configurations, built-in CI/CD pipelines, and doing security in that manner. But that largely only applies new fixes or changes to configurations and such. There may be some remediation for things, but if a firmware is actually implanted, those tools aren't actually detecting that stuff. So even in that situation, they can be compromised and never know it. And when they do detect it is when their network detection and response systems see an IOC go across the wire that they're inspecting. And that's when they can do the detection. And there's a little bit of a fallacy of logic here where the assumption is once they implant something like an external firewall, for example, you're going to detect it with an NDR when they try to move laterally. Well, my line of thinking is I don't want them to ever actually do that initial attempt, and I want to be able to detect that too. So that's where we come in to be a control to detect that.
Yeah. By the time they're doing lateral movement, that means there's a beachhead established. They got in somewhere and they have certainly before, they know that lateral movement detection is a thing. They know the network's getting monitored. Obviously, attempting to establish some sort of persistence before that happened. So it's almost like if that's what you're detecting, um, that it's very reactive. It's not proactive. And I think that there is a huge opportunity and mandate, honestly, especially among these huge global organizations, to get more proactive with security, which requires looking at these areas where the attacker will establish that persistence and can establish persistence that will survive reboots and survive total reimages before they ever start trying to like move laterally or expand their footprint.
Awesome. So we have a couple takeaways here, and largely we're going to see that this is going to continue to get worse. The attackers are in a scenario where they have the upper hand, and they're going to continue to have the upper hand for probably a couple more years. They have huge caches of 0 days that are still waiting to be found that will be found. And, even though we think that the devices that are targeted by ransomware groups are not the same that the APTs target, as Chase was mentioning, a lot of times these are actually the same people. So the same ransomware group could be the same APT. we as customers need to try to hold vendors accountable for that transparency and ability for us to validate things. What I do see end up occurring is that governments are likely going to end up forcing the hand by forcing that transparency through C-SCRIM requirements and regulations. But that's going to end up exposing that no vendor is really more secure than any others. So my one ask out of all of this is really just simply to demand SBOMs or software bill of materials from your vendors to provide transparency into the products that they're delivering.
Yeah. Oh man, that sort of accountability action from a buyer to a vendor. There's yet another stat from the DBIR. This thing was a juicy one. Everybody should really go read that DBIR from this year. Was that a third party was involved in 30% of the breaches that they investigated for the report, and a third party that can include a pretty broad range of entities, but it can definitely include technology vendors. And the involvement of the overall like first and sort of second ring of the supply chain, where it's like anybody that you're buying from, any organization that you allow to have remote connectivity into your environment can be the source of an initial access. And you really have very little way to hold them accountable. Third-party risk management is a discipline. A lot of it involves doing questionnaires, getting sort of attestations from these vendors about their security practices. But what are you doing after that? After you install them, how are you making sure that they're actually holding up their end of the bargain and not exposing you to risk? And I think that a lot of organizations are not doing a whole lot of that. And that's something that Eclipsium can really help deliver on, is to monitor and assure that the stuff you got from the vendor is what you thought you were going to get. It's what you paid for, and that it continues to deliver the level of security and protection that that was promised. And if not, you go back to them and say, this is not this is not what we paid for, and we need some accountability on that. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that sort of accountability coming around. One of the reports that the DBIR itself cited was from an insurance company, a cyber insurance company, that I think said, I'm paraphrasing, don't exactly quote me, but it's about 40% of the claims that cyber insurance company had processed were involved some sort of a third party as well. And so it's like cyber insurance companies are having to pay out, or at least having to process claims and deal with situations that are caused by some third party that their client found to be lacking in security. And that's a staggering number. Back a couple years ago, I feel there was a big trend of ransomware getting so bad that you just couldn't insure it. There was like these caps on ransomware insurance policies that were far lower than the actual ransom amounts that were being demanded. And the insurance companies were just like, we're not going to insure you against this. It's too bad. It's like getting fire or flood insurance in certain parts of the country where it's just not, it's so guaranteed to happen and be worse than the insurance can cover that they're just not going to do it. And I think we're going to start to see some movement towards that with third parties, where it's like at the point where it becomes uninsurable, um, you have to take another approach to protect yourself against those kinds of things. So I'm not seeing currently any questions from the audience. Someone asked, will the slides be shared? I'll just reiterate that yes, we will be sharing these slides and the recording of this session. So anybody who's here or anybody who signed up, you'll get that. You can share it with your colleagues and coworkers. If anybody else has other questions you want to throw out super quickly in this last minute or so, go for it. Otherwise, yeah, we'll just say thank you so much for joining us for this session on protecting the network edge from ransomware and APTs in 0 days. And okay, we got a thank you in the chat. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate y'all sticking around, and we'll reach out with the recording and the slides coming up really soon. Let's see. All right, Wes, any parting words before we tap out? Otherwise, we can hand it back to Melissa to take us home.
No, I think I'm good to go. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chase, and thank you, Wes, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just look for that email with the links that'll be coming from me. And we will be scheduling our next webinar soon. It'll be a great one. It's going to be around some of our new AI infrastructure capabilities that we were talking about at RSA. So hope we see you on the next one. Thanks, everyone.